Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Adam's Music Box, where it was during this week in 1980 that the album Voices was released by Daryl Hall and John Oates. Now, Hall and Oates have been in the news a lot lately because of various lawsuits uh, between one another, statements that they never really liked each other, and the kind of legal revelations that we already kind of knew, and that one was the senior and one was the junior partner, but the junior didn't necessarily want to be junior. But anyway, beyond all that melodrama, there's actually a really interesting thing I want to talk about. Well, hopefully you find it interesting because I sure do. About that album Voices in 1980. Now, it was at this time that Hall and Oates were already very well beloved by audiences throughout the world, even though some of their biggest hits were just around the corner, because Voices was, of course, followed up by Private Eyes, which was absolutely a smash hit of an album that produced many singles. Voices was also very popular because it contained the single Kiss on My List, which was co-written by Daryl Hall, and of course, a very well beloved cover of You've Lost That Love and Feeling, which was originally made famous by a wonderful, wonderful vocal duo that we will be talking about soon, I'm sure, the Righteous Brothers. But also on the album was a song with music and lyrics by Daryl Hall, and this is Every Time You Go Away. And when you listen to that song, you think, wow, this has got single potential. It's got an interesting narrative. It's got a theme people can relate to. It's got really a memorable, again, if you can if it's memorable after a first listen, there's a good chance it's going to be a hit piece of music. So the chord changes are memorable. It's got a lot of tension that then resolves itself in the chorus. It's got all the makings of a hit single, but for whatever reason, they didn't release that as a single, although it did come to back to life a few years later in 1985 from Paul Young, who released it as a single, and it became not only one of his biggest singles, but one of the biggest international singles of that year. Now, that proved several things. It proves that if you want to make a song your own, as someone who isn't necessarily a songwriter, but a singer, mine deeply into the album tracks of some of your favorite artists. Whether they be performers or songwriters, don't just say, oh, that's a good single, because it takes a lot of talent and a lot of, confidence to take something that's already been a hit single and make it a hit single again. Hall and Oates did it with You've Lost That Love and Feeling, but it isn't necessarily easy to do. So take a look at some of the deep cuts. We just the other day talked about Sinead O'Connor, whose biggest single was Nothing Compares to You, which was a kind of obscure track by Prince's project called The Family. And that's frankly something I would consider an example of mining something a bit deeper below the surface of the singles and turning it into a hit of your own. You could say that Johnny Cash's Hurt took a piece of music, a song by Nine Inch Nails, and really made it stratospheric. And the reason that happened is he took a risk. Most people don't associate Nine Inch Nails with Johnny Cash, or at least they didn't before he released his version of Hurt. Now they'll be inseparable till the end of time because of his very original, very Johnny Cash interpretation of a song by a sort of postmodern rock band. And so that's a lesson that I think could be instructive to a lot of people who are looking to do something to put their name on the map as a singer. Because if you don't write songs yourself, take a listen to the stuff by great artists that might not be remembered and resurrect it, bring it back to the fore. And that will also lead people back to the original. So while the Paul Young version of Every Time You Go was all over FM AM radio, which was still a thing just in 1985 in terms of music. It was revived later in that decade as the home of talk radio. The 80s was really that decade in the US where AM transitions from mainly music based to almost exclusively talk based. But be that as it may, if you heard the Paul Young version, you'll go back and hear the original if you're curious enough. And I highly recommend you listening to them both side by side. do some interesting comparisons and contrasts between Hall's voice and Young's voice, their different approaches, their different intonation. Moral of the story is it's a good song, and good songs are to be found even if they're not released as singles. Never forget that. People into the sort of heavy rock world or jazz world know that already. It's true in the pop world as well. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.